Hello, everybody, and welcome to World Talks. I'm Don Arleth, and let's go ahead and get started. The last meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group at Ramstein Air Base in Germany under the Biden administration is taking place today. The U.S. has pledged another $500 million in assistance for Ukraine, the last money and weapons to be delivered before Donald Trump takes the reins in the White House on January 20th. And now joining me to discuss what we can expect to come from this meeting is Andrew Dianeri, resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Hello, and thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, now $500 million looks like the last little bit from the Biden administration. What can we expect in terms of weapons and assistance for Ukraine from this final package?
So the final package is $500 million, not an insignificant sum, of course, of the few billion that's left of money that's been appropriated by Congress to support Ukraine. The Trump administration, importantly, will have a few $billion to play with to send to Ukraine in the first months of their administration as well. This current package is mainly ammunition, air defense support, and other kind of technical training and capacity work as well. So again, more of what Ukraine needs. It's this has become such a war of volume on the front line of ammunition and with drones. Ukraine, of course, has a bit of a comparative advantage with small drones, but they do need the heavy artillery and ammunition that the U.S. and Europeans can provide, as well as the air defense to support the home front. So another significant package from the U.S.
Certainly. Now, these contact group meetings have been highly successful, being implemented just after the onset of the war back in 2022. Will this be the final contact group meeting, or is this just the last one underneath the Biden administration?
This is just the last one under the Biden administration. I think you're right to say that it's been an incredibly successful format, aligning not only Ukraine, the United States, and NATO allies, but a number of countries that aren't necessarily in the NATO alliance in support of Ukraine, and getting everyone in the West essentially on the same page and trying to support Ukraine militarily in ways that each country can. I do expect the Trump administration will join the Ramstein format when they do take office here in a couple weeks. It's also possible that even if the Trump administration chooses to take a step back from that European allies will still convene this format or in a similar format. We heard some defense ministers and officials today say exactly that. So I don't think this is the last one. And I think the only change we could see is a little bit to the format, participants, but the focus should remain the same.
One thing that sticks out in my mind is this interview that President Zelensky just had with Lex Friedman, this 3-hour interview just recently. According to President Zelensky, the President said that he has only received about half of what's been allocated for Ukraine when faced with questions of corruption and what have you. And then I believe you just mentioned earlier that there's still a few $1 billion left in this supplemental that was granted earlier last year, but it hasn't been utilized. So can you clarify exactly why there's such a gap in what is allocated and what actually makes it to Ukraine and what actually is utilized?
Well, I won't bore our viewers with the exact Pentagon terminology and everything here, but essentially, a large part of what is appropriated to support Ukraine actually stays here in the United States to backfill our own stocks of weapons, that many of which are being sent to Ukraine. So that's the first thing, is actually a large amount of the billions we hear talked about do stay in the United States. But it has taken really a criminally long amount of time often for American, especially, capabilities to reach Ukraine. We saw this with tanks. We've seen this with HIMARS, all sorts of things that really it just takes too long to procure them, to get them set, and to go off to Europe and then to Ukraine. So that's something that really does need to be fixed. And I should note that there are also problems with this in Europe. The Europeans promised 1 million rounds of artillery by the end of 2024. I think they fell just short of that. They missed a couple of deadlines. So this is really forced all allied nations to kind of take another look at their defense procurement, the way they do things, and try to speed that along because they know that the war is in Ukraine now, but Europe and the United States certainly need to be prepared for the possibility of further conflict in the future, especially if we allow Russia to take further territory in Ukraine.
Right now, in the final days of the Biden administration, we've heard that the administration would like to make Kyiv as strong as possible moving forward towards any eventual peace talks. We're starting to hear the same thing from Donald Trump, that he is not able to solve the war, in just one day. It might take up to 6 months, according to his latest assessment, and that he also wants to bolster Kyiv. So is this a continuance of strategy to try and get Ukraine in a good, strong position so that it can negotiate to the best possible ability with Russia if Russia does indeed sit at the table?
Well, here's the thing. Logically, it makes perfect sense to make Ukraine as strong as possible, not only so they can have the greatest amount of success on the battlefield, but also, if we are looking at negotiations, to put them in the best spot possible. Now, the Biden administration has done a solid job on this, but they've, like we just talked about, been too slow in sending weapons to Ukraine and too timid in what they've sent. So I think they have tried to put Ukraine in a good position, but they could have done much more, much faster. And now they're playing catch up. They're finally realizing this. The Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration, has also said they want to help Ukraine negotiate from a position of strength. But to do that, they need to essentially turbocharge what the Biden administration has been doing and give Ukraine the military capabilities it needs to stop Russia making gains and actually get Russia to come to the negotiating table. Because right now, Trump can talk all he wants, but the noises we hear in Moscow are from folks in the Kremlin. If we're not going to be stopped on the battlefield, why would we come to negotiate when they have greater interest not only in Ukraine but against the West as a whole? So it's really good to talk about wanting to strengthen Ukraine and to negotiate from a position of strength. But in the first instance, we need that strength and to give Ukraine what it needs to defend itself, to stop the Russians on their advance, which is still ongoing in Ukraine. So that we can get to the negotiating table. I think that's the first thing for the Trump administration to do, is to actually recognize that the issue is that Russia has greater designs, not only in Ukraine, but beyond, especially against our NATO allies, and to equip Ukraine to the best degree possible so as to stop those gains.
Now, in terms of Donald Trump and his incoming administration, he has signaled to, off the record, if you will, signaled to some European leaders that he is going to need their support for Ukraine, and America doesn't need to get or will not tolerate getting ripped off. How do you expect the future, if the contact group remains, that format remains in Ramstein with the United States? Do you think there'll be some kind of condition that Europe needs to match or outpace American aid for the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, I think there's two things here. Number one, the Trump administration or incoming Trump administration, and of course the Biden administration as well, have recognized, and the Europeans recognize this as well, that Europe does need to do more for its own defense. The U.S. cannot indefinitely subsidize European defense and their support for Ukraine. So I do think Europe will need to step up and send more aid and invest more in their own military technology. That's a given. That's number one. The second is, again, we have to come back to peace through strength, which is what the Trump team has said they'll do. And if you want to be strong, you want to get the outcomes you desire, and to especially force the Europeans to spend more, to contribute more to our kind of mutual transatlantic security, it behooves them, the United States that is, to remain in the NATO alliance, to remain in the Ramstein contact group, rather than try to threaten to leave or to not participate, and to threaten things from the outside. So I think one thing that we should be looking for is for the Trump administration to realize that they're stronger and can be more effective when they're actually a participant in these formats.
Now, in terms of President Biden and his administration and his legacy in dealing with this war since the full-scale invasion in February of 2022, based on where we are right now, how do you think that historians will look at this chapter in history?
I think it'll be really a mixed bag. And it's a really interesting question. I think because we have reasonable evidence that the Biden administration did do a remarkable job in rallying Western countries to support Ukraine, to getting allies to do more, and to helping Ukraine defend itself against let's be honest, a much bigger military, a much bigger country with greater resources than Ukraine itself has. So I think they get credit there. But where they'll, I think, lose credit in the eyes of historians is just how scared they were of escalation and of helping Ukraine to win, and just how much they allowed themselves to be intimidated by threats from the Kremlin, threats from Moscow, and how they really didn't do all that they could to give Ukraine what it needed to push the Russians back on the battlefield, even though they had some success, and to compel the Europeans to contribute even more than they've already done. So I think maybe they get probably a B plus in the historian's report card.
Now, and some levied the criticism that Biden gave, well, too little and too late. But if we look at the scope of what has been given, maybe the too late issue is indeed true. If Biden would have given everything that we now know has been allocated for Ukraine sooner, would that have made a difference in terms of saving Ukrainian lives and helping Ukrainian capabilities to defend themselves, their territory? What are your thoughts?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I would go back to the much vaunted Ukrainian counteroffensive that we were all preparing for. The Biden administration sent tanks, armored personnel carriers, trainers to set up the Ukrainians to break Russian lines in the spring of 2023, and to help them gain more territory, to break the Russian land bridge to Crimea, and to help Ukraine take back the territory that is its own sovereign territory controlled by Russia. But what the Biden administration didn't do is they didn't give Ukraine long-range fires like ATACMS. They didn't give Ukraine F-16s and air cover, which the U.S. When the U.S. military trains for combined arms maneuvers, like the U.S. was training Ukraine to do, those are two components that they have in every single exercise. But the Biden administration declined to give Ukraine those capabilities. And then when the counteroffensive largely failed and Ukraine abandoned those plans, the Biden administration threw its hands up and said, well, this was doomed from the beginning. And that's not true. If they'd given Ukraine what we in the West, what we in the United States would use to do such a maneuver, Ukraine would have had far more success. So I think the Biden administration hamstrung itself in the aid that it gave Ukraine, especially within the first 18 months of the war. That could have made a huge difference, and we'd be looking at a vastly different picture if Ukraine had gotten in a shorter period of time all that they were asking for and all that they needed in the counteroffensive.
Well, we're certainly at an interesting crossroads with President-elect Donald Trump just about to take the reins. And of course, we'll have to see exactly what that brings. Andrew Dianeri, resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, thank you. Great to see you again, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks very much. See you soon.
And that concludes this round of World Talks. Thank you very much for watching, and stay with us for more here on TVP World.